through the efforts of B'nai Yehuda, which had been responsible, without intending it, to cause this slum condition right here in McClure Place, and through their efforts in connection with the Tenement Commission of Kansas City, cleared out this area one by one family, moving it to the north end, which for them became the second home in America, and certainly in Kansas City, and about which we will talk at greater length later on. What happened here after all of the Russian refugees had left? Well, true to form, the brothers Maston wanted to continue to make all the money they possibly could out of this space. The city council wanted them to move, but it did not have the power to make them clear out, and so they wouldn't. Well, by 1912, all of these houses stood empty. So what happened was that the Union Station started to be built by out-of-town laborers. Union Station is just a very short distance to the south of here. And all of these out-of-town laborers were housed right here in these little houses on McClure. All of the out-of-town laborers housed here. But by 1914, the station had been built. These people had left again. And at that point, even though they tried their best, the Maston brothers could no longer find customers, so they themselves reluctantly tore down the houses but retained ownership of the ground, built a 6-story office building for themselves, which stood here until the 1970s or beyond, with a big sign calling it the Maston Insurance Company building. And this became Motor Row. Virtually all of the car dealers in Kansas City had their showrooms right on this block, some facing McGee, some facing Grant, and they were parking their unsold cars in between. Motor Row was here until World War II and really beyond. And I remember stories from people like the Sight brothers and the Felds and other owners, Jewish owners of car dealerships, who very well remembered getting their start here in what was called Kansas City Motor Row. So we now take leave and go to the north end and see what happened to the refugees there. We're standing in front of a building that represents the last visible hallmark of the Jewish community of the 19th century. We're going back here to 1894, when this building opened on New Year's Day as the third home of a social club called the Progress Club. At the time, it had about 120 members, families, all belonging to Congregation B'nai Yehuda, the first Jewish congregation in Kansas City. Congregation B'nai Yehuda was founded in 1870 by 25 families, the majority of them from German-speaking countries, although a few were Native Americans, but native to this country. B'nai Yehuda has the distinction, and it may be a unique one in all of America, of being the first congregation, the first Jewish congregation in a city that was reformed from the very beginning. I know of no other community in America where that was the fact. Practically all Reformed congregations we know today, including those that had their beginnings as Reformed, in those early years started out as Orthodox congregations and did not turn to Reform until a second congregation was formed as an Orthodox one, and then they moved to become the Reform alternative in their respective communities. But here, unlike virtually everywhere else and perhaps anywhere else in America, the very first congregation, B'nai Yehuda, started off as Reform, men and women seated together, a mixed choir of men and women with an organ, no cantor in the beginning. The rabbi did not wear a cap or other head covering, neither did the men of the congregation at any time in those days. In fact, there were times when it was expressly forbidden for men to have their heads covered during worship. We know this from the early constitutions of the congregation. This building was the third home of the Progress Club, a Jewish social club for what in 1908 was described in a history of Kansas City as the club for the better class of Jews, a reference, no doubt, to the German-born Jews who were also members of B'nai Yehuda. There's a 1905 roster of the members of the Progress Club. It's in my History of the Congregation, Roots in a Moving Stream, as published in the Blue Book, so-called, for that year, along with the roster of the members of the local Council of Jewish Women. They liked to boast about belonging here. Charles Curtis, C-U-R-T-I-S-S, was the architect. He ultimately designed various homes, pristine homes on Ward Parkway and several downtown office buildings. He was the best known architect in Kansas City in his day. The building originally had balconies, wrought iron fronted. The first floor was the dining room, and there were card rooms. Upstairs was the ballroom for dances, including coming out parties for the young ladies of what was called Jewish society. And to be in Jewish society, you had to be a member of B'nai Yehuda and probably born either in Germany or already in this country. We have some oral histories of ladies who had their debutante occasion in this building. This was sold in 1910 by the Progress Club. At that time it moved into what later became a funeral home on West Linwood Boulevard. And in 1912 they bought an old stone building in Grandview and enlarged it, and is now known as the Oakwood Country Club. But this was one of the early places for the Progress Club. Originally had 40 members when they started out in the John Taylor Dry Goods Company at 11th and Main, and then moved to what became Adler's store at 1208 Main, where they were for quite a while, and then finally coming here in 1893, remaining here for 17 years. The YMCA moved its downtown facilities from 10th Street around Oak or Locust to this location about 20 years or so ago, and it is now in use by people who are living on Quality Hill. It is again Quality Hill, as it was named originally, meaning that the people of quality, social quality, financial quality, resided in this area, including the wealthier Jews. In my history of Congregation B'nai Yehuda, I refer to that ground as measuring 1/5 of an acre. I subsequently discovered that a fault in the title, in the original title, described it in that manner. It was actually 4/5 of an acre, almost an acre. On the north side of 18th Street, where today the city buses are parked overnight. Now, are they parked on top of graves? Not at all. There were 37 burials at 18th and Lydia between 1866 and 1872. In 1872, Elmwood Cemetery, comprised of 40 acres and ranging from 12th Street on the north to 15th Street, now Truman Road, on the south, and from Elmwood Avenue on the west to Van Brandt Boulevard on the east. The 40 acres purchased by what then was called the for-profit Elmwood Cemetery Association. The vice president of that association happened to be the president of B'nai Yehuda, Benjamin Feineman, a highly successful wholesaler in liquors, who had previously been a founding president of Temple Adas Joseph in St. Joseph in 1860, and who had moved to Kansas City in 1868 to establish a branch of his wholesale liquor business. He became the sole owner, transferred the entire operation to Kansas City, and prospered here, became the first Jewish member of the City Council of Kansas City in 1875 on the Republican ticket, and was re-elected for a second term. He and some of the others, all of them buried here, were founders of the Kansas City Board of Trade, which is really today's Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, renamed. Has no relationship to the present Board of Trade. That original Board of Trade also established the railroad between Kansas City and Galveston, Texas, the Katy Railroad. We are at Elmwood Cemetery along Truman Road, just west of Van Brandt Boulevard. Elmwood is a 40-acre private cemetery. It's bounded on the south by what now is Truman Road, originally 15th Street, on the north by 12th Street, on the east by Van Brandt Boulevard, and on the west by Elmwood Street. We're now, in back of me is Elmwood Street, the westernmost fence. The original Jewish cemetery for Kansas City Jews was at 18th and Lydia on the north side of 18th Street. It was purchased in 1866 by 2 or 3 Jewish pioneers in Kansas City, Herman and Bernard Gans, Louis Hammerslau, Benjamin Feineman among them, from the Lockridge family, the original owners. It was measured about 3/4 of an acre and served the Hebrew Benevolent Society, the name of the original cemetery society, from 1866 until 1872. You had to be a member of the society to have a choice of location in that old cemetery by paying 10 cents a month. That was the membership fee. In 1872, Congregation B'nai Yehuda, then 2 years old, purchased 2 acres here in Elmwood, at the southwest corner of the cemetery, purchased it from the Elmwood Cemetery Association, which was a for-profit organization that had purchased the cemetery as a whole just a few months earlier. The vice president of the association was Benjamin Feineman, who at the time was also the president of Congregation B'nai Yehuda, a well-to-do wholesaler in liquor business. Previously had been president of Adas Joseph in St. Joseph, Missouri, one of its early ones, and president of the first B'nai B'rith Lodge in western Missouri, likewise in St. Joseph. The first B'nai B'rith Lodge, in fact, between St. Louis and Virginia City, Nevada. Benjamin Feineman made a good deal for the congregation. He paid $200, or the congregation paid $200 for these 2 acres, plus the ground vacated at 18th and Lydia, for which I think the Elmwood Cemetery Association finally received about $600 cash. So it was a good deal all around. There were over 30 interments at 18th and Lydia between 1866 and 1872, and all of those remains were transferred over to this site. They're all buried now here at Elmwood Cemetery in the B'nai Yehuda section. Some sources refer to it simply as the Jewish section, but it is actually the property of Congregation B'nai Yehuda. When the congregation bought the 2 acres, it received a deed, which we still have in our files at B'nai Yehuda, which says that the Elmwood Cemetery Association would forever give this section the same quality care as it would for the rest of the cemetery, and it has done so throughout the years. Not always equally good, or I should say, the best it could do for the entirety of the cemetery. It has had its financial problems here because someone absconded with the original Perpetual Care Fund, and a new one was not started until the time of World War II, at which time there was very little ground left to be sold by what was then the Elmwood Cemetery Society, a not-for-profit organization. And so it relies today a good deal on volunteers to keep the place in decent shape, which it is, and they are doing their foremost to do so. We want to visit some of the grave sites, talk about the people who are buried here, because they represent some of the pioneer settlers of the Jewish community of Kansas City. Isaac